Chapter 16. The new year brought with it an unexpected visit from Tayo's uncle, and the first chance for Vanessa to meet someone from Tayo's family. They were all to have afternoon tea at the Randolph Hotel, which was where Vanessa now waited for Tayo and his uncle Kayode. She sat in the lounge next to an open fire, feeling uncomfortably warm, but this, she guessed, was where Tayo would prefer to sit. While she waited, she watched people serving themselves tea from fat china teapots while sampling scones and cakes. This was Oxford's finest hotel, but Vanessa did not care for the musty, stuffy feel that came from the large, upholstered armchairs and the carpet in sombre shades of green and mustard. The walls were wood panelling, and several large chandeliers hung low from the ceiling. She wondered what Tayo's uncle would make of the Randolph, and, more importantly, what he would think of her. This wasn't just any old family friend, but Tayo's favourite uncle, and while she looked forward to meeting him, she worried. Tayo had once told her, though she suspected he might now have forgotten, that in his culture one never introduced a girlfriend to family unless the relationship was serious. So this was surely a good sign for her. But what if she disappointed his uncle? What would Tayo think of her then? Everything had been going so well since the new year, and she desperately wanted it to stay that way, especially now that Tayo only had a few more months left at Oxford. She secretly hoped he might propose before leaving. Nervously, she ran through her list of greetings. Ekason, shalafeni. She was still practicing when Tayo arrived with his uncle. Ekason, shalafeni, she said, curtsying as she'd seen it done. Vanessa, my dear, lovely to meet you, the uncle said, in such a reassuring tone that it made her feel at ease. He was taller and younger than Vanessa expected, and more effusive too. Splendid, he exclaimed, when the waitress arrived with their Darjeeling tea, scones, sandwiches and cake. Uncle Kayode had insisted on ordering everything. Now, Vanessa, do tell me, what does one begin with? Scones, sandwiches or cake? I've never known. And does one put cream on these things first or jam? He waved at the plate of scones. Whatever catches your fancy, I think, Vanessa smiled. Ah, but everything catches my fancy, and that, my dear, is the problem, he laughed as he peered eagerly at the top tray. Now, here we have a most exquisite collection of gâteaux, a little almond marzipan, shortbread, some macaroons, petit four, and what do you suppose this is? He pointed to a rectangular slice. Something German, I think, to render the platter a true representation of Europe. A Bavarian torte or some such thing, wouldn't you say? But just look at these other two trays, so quintessentially English. And crustless sandwiches like the ones we were served at school cricket games, Tayo added. Indeed, Uncle Kayode winked conspiratorially at Tayo. For what is good for the English must also be good for their protégés abroad, and especially at those elite institutions like Fiditi Boys. Vanessa, dear, did this chap ever tell you about the first-class schools he attended? Tayo tried to interrupt, but his uncle was keen to boast of his nephew's academic achievements, as well as his sporting prowess. I wasn't captain of every team, Tayo laughed. Yes, but nobody's talking about silly sports like table tennis or hockey, Uncle chuckled, adding something extra for Tayo's benefit in Yoruba. But look, let us partake of this wonderful tea. He opened a scone and spread it generously with clotted cream. I don't think there's anything that beats warm English scones with a dab of butter, a dollop of cream, and strawberry jam. So, I say, what's the good of touring dusty old barracks when some other occupation would allow me to travel and visit my nephew and his charming young lady over this most civilized afternoon tea? Enough of army life. Are you really thinking of leaving the army, Uncle? Tayo asked. Indeed I am, Uncle Kayode nodded. Engineering is what I'm considering, and I would do it at the Institut Français du Pétrole in France. What do you think, Vanessa? Why engineering? She asked, flattered to be asked for an opinion. Ah, now that's what I like, a woman who asks questions, he said, leaning forward in his chair to explain that the future of Nigeria was no longer in its army, as some used to think, but in the oil business. Of course, there are many places here in Britain where I could study, but who can turn down an offer from France? Ce pays de liberté, égalité et fraternité. Ah, vous parlez français, Vanessa replied. Mais oui. I think that's enough of the French, Tayo interrupted. Absolutely, Uncle Kayode laughed. In any case, I'm afraid that was the limit of my French. But Tayo, didn't your mother teach you French? Does my mother speak French? Tayo looked surprised. Why, of course. How do you think she conducts her business? Let me tell you, Vanessa. Tayo's mother is the most successful trader along the West African coast. Tayo hasn't told you? She regularly visits Benin, Dahomey, and Ivory Coast, and she's chief of all the textile traders in Ibadan, which is a very revered position in our Yoruba culture. But, Uncle, Tayo protested. Vanessa smiled at Tayo, for it was obvious that Uncle Kayode was enjoying telling the stories, and she was enjoying listening. But do tell me something about you now, my dear. Tayo tells me that you write beautifully, so tell me about your writings and those writers you admire. She didn't know at first how much of her work might be of any real interest to him, but as she spoke it was clear that he was listening closely. Twice he let his tea go cold. It was only when Tayo reminded them that Uncle Kayode had a train to catch that they noticed how much time had passed. "How unfortunate," Uncle Kayode grumbled. "With Vanessa's talk of women's issues, I was going to impress you both by telling you about my recent encounter with Anais Nin." "Anais Nin?" Uncle Kayode nodded, smiling at their joint surprise. "Then we can't possibly end the conversation," Vanessa insisted. "So come with us to the station and I'll tell you about the lovely Anais." The lovely Anais. Vanessa smiled to herself, wondering how much Tayo knew about Anais and what he thought of his uncle, who seemed not at all embarrassed by this writer of erotica. She didn't know much about Anais Nin herself, but enough to find it surprising that an African man whose training had not been in the arts would not be critical. With an uncle like this, Vanessa felt certain that she would love the rest of Tayo's family. Chapter 17. It came as a surprise, or more accurately, a shock, when Tayo received an invitation from Mr. Richardson to lead the Bellamy's Boys' School Assembly with a lecture on Nigeria. Tayo had given many talks about Nigeria while in England, often to schools and sometimes to churches, but this request was the most important thus far, not only because of the school's excellent reputation, but because the invitation came from Vanessa's father, and it couldn't have come at a better time. Tayo had just received news of his first-class degree and of a graduate scholarship. There was a time when Tayo told himself that he didn't care what Vanessa's father thought of him, but that had never really been true. It was certainly not true now that his relationship with Vanessa had grown more serious, which was why Tayo had taken extra time and care to prepare for the talk. He made sure he had all the necessary facts and had practiced his delivery so that on the day all would go well. "What do you clever boys know about Nigeria?" Tayo began. A flurry of little hands went up. "Nigeria's near the desert. The people don't wear clothes. Boys play with animals. It's boiling hot." Tayo thanked each boy for their contribution, pleased that children spoke openly, which made it easy for him to identify and correct their stereotypes. Instead of giving a simplified version of what he usually presented to adults, an overview of Nigeria's history, its topography, its main industries and political parties, Tayo began with stories of his childhood. He could sense that he had the boys' full attention, but was nevertheless relieved to receive confirmation of this with their enthusiastic applause at the very end. "Bravo," Mr. Richardson said, patting Tayo on the back as he led him to his study, which reminded Tayo of Mr. Faircliffe's office. It had that same stuffy smell of old books and papers, and the same neat row of trophies and shields displayed within glass cabinets. Even some of the decorations, the Nigerian gourds and masks, were similar to those that hung in his old headmaster's office in Ibadan. "Do sit," Mr. Richardson gestured to Tayo, so that they would sit facing each other across the large office desk. Tayo felt pleased with how things had gone and waited for Mr. Richardson to finish fiddling with his pipe so that they could discuss the assembly further. But Mr. Richardson had other things on his mind. "What are your intentions with my daughter?" he asked, catching Tayo off guard. "My daughter seems very enamoured with you," he added, not waiting for Tayo's reply. "And you of her, I imagine?" "Well, yes, sir, Tayo stammered, struggling to find his words. "You see, Tayo," Mr. Richardson continued, taking his pipe from his mouth, "in many ways, you and I are quite similar, aren't we? I was fond of a woman from a different class in the way that you seem fond of a woman of a different race. My wife, as you know, is from the upper classes, and her family didn't approve of me. You understand, don't you?" Tayo nodded, deciding it was easier to let Mr. Richardson talk, for it was obvious that he had things he wanted to say, and little that he wanted to hear. "Well, Mrs. Richardson and I married, but our families have never entirely accepted our marriage. Now, with you and Vanessa, if you were to ever think of marriage, you would face an even greater challenge, one that is, I fear, insurmountable. I hope you understand it is my duty to warn you of this, and that I have a responsibility for my daughter's happiness. You must certainly be aware of the difficulties of a cross-racial union." Tayo nodded, still thrown by what he was hearing. Did Mr. Richardson think he wanted to marry his daughter? And then to go on like this about the challenges that mixed-race couples face with half-caste children, how presumptuous of the man. "And Vanessa is impetuous, you see," Mr. Richardson continued, "and has a tendency to dash into things. Not long ago she got all hot and bothered about Lumumba, wanting to go to the Congo. Really, she is most naive, always jumping into things, like her mother at that age. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "Yes," Tayo answered. "What you're saying is that I must not think of marrying your daughter." "What I am saying, young man, is that the challenges would be great, and as someone who is older and wiser, I must advise you against the idea." And that was how it ended, or was supposed to end. But Tayo still had the journey back to Oxford, where Vanessa was waiting for him, eager to hear how things had gone. How was it? She asked, slipping an arm around his waist as they walked back to college from where they'd met in town. You're quiet. What's the matter? Nothing, he said, still not knowing what to tell her. Oh, come on, something's wrong, I can tell. She stopped and turned to face him just as a policeman cycled past. All right, miss? The policeman asked, propping one foot on the ground. Yes, Vanessa snapped. The policeman hesitated, looked Tayo up and down, and then pedalled away. What's the matter? Tell me. I'm fine, Vanessa. Let's go. No, not before you tell me. What is it? She insisted, reaching for his hand. He stopped as she reached with her other hand to touch the side of his face. Tell me, she urged. Today your father... My father what? Could we talk about this later, Vanessa? He said, trying to pull away. My father said what? She insisted. Your father told me that he didn't approve of us. What do you mean? He's always said good things about you. No, he hasn't. Tayo didn't mean to shake Vanessa off in anger, but he was tired of her being so naive. Did she really think her father liked him? And now she was looking innocently at him, gazing into his eyes as she reached again for his hand. He held it briefly, then let go. Vanessa, we can't have a future together when your father is so opposed. What do you mean? Tell me what he said. He said it would be difficult for us, that the cultures would be too different, and that one day if we were to... Well, it would be difficult if we had children. Well, who cares what he says? She replied, folding her arms defiantly. All that matters is that we love each other. But relationships are also about family, Vanessa. And I would sacrifice my family for you, Tayo. Vanessa, he pleaded, placing his hands on her shoulders. You know I wouldn't let you do that. We must respect your father. You're young, and Nigeria is not a calm place these days. Perhaps it's God's will. Oh, bloody hell, don't bring God into this, she said, pushing his arms away. So now you think I'm too young? You think I don't know what I want? Not too young, Vanessa, but just too independent sometimes. Look, Vanessa, it's late. I can't think straight and... Too independent? It's you, Tayo, who needs to learn some independence. You won't confront these things, will you? You register something, block it out of your mind and never deal with it. My father's a racist. It's simple. Don't you see that? But Vanessa, you just told me that your father didn't mean it. Well, of course I'd say that. It's much easier to pretend, isn't it? But I'm tired of that and we should just stand up to it. Don't just turn the other cheek with my father or the policeman or what? You want me to confront the policeman just now? And your father? And tell them what? That they're racist? You confront them, Vanessa, if it's so easy. And it's so easy for you, isn't it, Tayo? You never wanted to marry an English girl anyway. That's still what it is, isn't it? Why don't you just go and find a nice, subservient Nigerian girl who'll do exactly what you say and agree with everything you want? Who's talking about marriage? Tayo shouted, then immediately regretted it. Mom? The policeman had returned and was jumping off his bicycle with baton in hand. Do we have some trouble here? Hands off her. I'm perfectly fine. Just bugger off, will you? Vanessa snapped. I beg your pardon? She's okay, we're together, Tayo replied. I wasn't asking you, the policeman warned. I'm okay, for God's sake, leave us alone, Vanessa shouted. Her shoulders were shaking, and Tayo took off his coat to wrap it around her. The policeman kept watching, but Tayo didn't care. He took Vanessa in his arms to comfort her, to comfort himself. It had started raining as Tayo walked back to college, and only then did he realize that he'd left his coat at Vanessa's. Usually he would have sprinted to outrun the shower, but the damp and drizzle had already seeped through his clothes the way English rain always did. No point in running, Tayo mumbled to himself. Maybe Vanessa was right. He should have stood up to her father and argued with him instead of giving in. He flicked the rain from his face and picked up his pace. If Vanessa really thought he couldn't stand up for himself, he would soon prove her wrong. I love her, Tayo spoke to the rain, damn her father, and damn every racist in England. For once in his life he was going to act on impulse and prove to Vanessa that he was capable of being a man of action. No one, not society, not her father, was going to stop him from proposing now. He ran the rest of the way back to college and stood panting for a few moments as he fumbled in his trouser pockets for his keys. He opened the little door that led into the porter's lodge and ducked, but still hit his head against the top of the doorframe and swore silently. Ah, Mr. Ajayi, the porter called out. Glad to see you. I've just popped a telegram under your door. Stayed here to make sure you got it. Thank you, Tayo nodded, walking faster to reach his rooms. Porters rarely worked late at night, especially not during the summer when college was less busy, so Tayo was worried. He jogged the last few yards and found the slip of paper sticking out from under his door. Baba is in hospital, recovering. Return home immediately, Mama. Chapter 18. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. The shrill voice of the muezzin pierced the morning silence with calls to prayer, jolting Tayo from sleep. He rolled over on his mattress and stretched his arms high above his head onto the cool cement floor, brushing his hand against the transistor radio. He reached for Vanessa, but she wasn't there. It took him a few moments to remember that he was back home in the small room normally used as storage space for rice and millet, which had been cleared out so he could have a space of his own. Everyone else, with the exception of his father, would be sleeping in crowded quarters. The older boys shared one room, as he had done when he was their age, and the girls and babies slept in their respective mothers' rooms. The whole of upstairs had been given over to Baba, and Tayo could hear him calling. It reminded him of the days when he was the one ordered to fetch water for his father, polish his shoes, or take him tea first thing in the morning. Now it was the younger ones, wife Amina's children, who cowered at the sound of Baba's bellowing. His father was a disciplinarian and a firm believer in corporal punishment. It was an approach that made children obedient, but at what cost, Tayo often wondered. From somewhere else in the house, he heard a woman scolding a child for taking too long to get ready, and he wondered which wife it was and whether she'd been the one to sleep upstairs the night before. These days it bothered Tayo to think that his father preferred the attention of the younger wives to his mother. When Vanessa had asked him how things worked between wives, he'd hardly given it a thought, but now he wondered. His mother seemed her usual jovial self, but maybe it was all a facade. He sometimes wished he could talk to Mama about her life, but there was never a moment when she was alone. Now, for example, she was outside chatting to the other wives as they drew water for morning baths. The standpipe was close to his room, and the metal buckets clanged against his wall. The smell of paraffin, used to light the outside fires, had already seeped in, and that, combined with the sticky heat of the new day, made him get up. He wiped his brow and stretched his arms again before reaching for his briefcase in search of writing paper. Soon his brothers and sisters would be knocking on the door, begging for more stories about England, and there would be guests to greet, places to visit, and people to see. So he needed to write to Vanessa before getting caught up in the day's events. As he took the paper from his case, he noticed 2 separate black lines running from his suitcase to the ceiling. Ants. What could there be in his case that had drawn them? Earlier he had emptied it of the melted black magic chocolates that were supposed to have been gifts for his brothers and sisters. Tayo sighed as he brushed them away, watching the black dots scatter, then regroup, persistent in their march. As a child he would have played with them, throwing them off course with chalk, but he didn't have time for that now. Remy, Tokbe, Bayo! Tayo heard his father bellow and guessed that he was standing at the top of the stairs, having spotted one of his sons, but unable to remember his name. Sure enough, he then shouted, Kini wong pe pa pa, which made Tayo laugh. It was a phrase he remembered well from his own childhood. Even then, when there were fewer names to commit to memory, Baba invariably forgot who was who and would bark in that same gruff voice. What do they call you anyway? There were so many children in the house these days, so many that Tayo could not keep track either. He even found it hard to recognize his own immediate brothers and sisters at first. BC had grown tall and thin like sugar cane, and brother Remy, who was just a boy in 1963, was now a young man, stylishly sporting the latest Nkrumah haircut. Apart from Baba, who was still convalescing, they had all been at the airport to welcome Tayo home, dressed in their finest, and some of the women were dancing as he came through customs. There was so much that he wanted to describe to Vanessa. 29th July, 1966. My dear Vanessa, I miss you so much and can't wait to see you again soon. I have been trying to write ever since I arrived in Ibadan, but each day I am besieged by family and friends. I barely have time to myself. So I'm rising early this morning to write before time is whisked away. How are you? And your mother and father? Tayo paused, thinking of his last encounter with Mr. Richardson. He despised the man for his bigotry, and yet, now that he was back home, he could see that persuading his own family to accept a white woman might prove more of a struggle than he'd originally imagined. Yesterday, when a family friend announced that his son would be marrying an Englishwoman, father had been skeptical. How will the woman fit in? He had asked, in a tone that Tayo found unnervingly similar to Mr. Richardson's. The only difference was that father's main objection lay in the fact that the woman's parents were divorced, while Mr. Richardson's objections were based on race. Both seemed wrong to Tayo, but there was at least one relative who had been enamored by his talk of Vanessa, and this was Uncle Bola. Yesterday, they'd sat together under the shade of a mango tree, chewing kola nut and sipping coconut milk. Uncle B had given up drink while Tayo had been away, and while his desire for booze might have diminished, his interest in women remained as strong as ever. When Tayo showed him photographs of Oxford, Uncle Bola spotted Vanessa straight away. He insisted on keeping the photograph, staining it red with the residue of kola nut. Bring the lady come my house when she come Nigeria, he said, beaming a toothless smile. Tayo was thinking of how best to describe his uncle to Vanessa when he heard people calling, running up and down the corridor. Brother Tayo! Brother Tayo! The knocking sounded urgent, so Tayo stood up quickly to answer the door. Brother Tayo! Ekaro! Remy said, dispensing with what was usually a much longer string of greetings. Kilo de! What's going on? Tayo asked. They say Naku, Remy answered, waving his hands like a crazy man. Ku, what do you mean? Tayo dropped his pen and tucked his singlet into his trousers as he ran with Remy to the front of the house. Normally, at this time of the morning, the front courtyard would be quiet, But now there was a crowd of women and children, neighbours, street sellers, and even the cripple who sold groundnuts 2 streets down. And in the middle of the crowd was someone he almost didn't see because of the commotion. "Modupe?" Tayo exclaimed, his jaw dropping as he saw the size of her stomach. "I didn't know," he said, hugging her clumsily. "Yes," she smiled, "and this is my husband, Olu." She gestured towards the tall man standing next to her. Tayo did not recognize the man and felt suddenly grateful for the chaos around him. Baba stood in the center of the crowd, clutching his radio as he spoke with Dele, the neighborhood drunk. "What is it?" Tayo asked, pushing his way to where his father stood. "Eka aro, Baba," he added, remembering he had not yet greeted his father. "Dele is telling us they tried to kill Ironzi last night," Baba replied. And then everyone started talking at the same time, with Dele repeating what had just been said, others disputing the facts, and Modupe's husband blaming it all on the northerners. Tayo took a good look at Modupe's husband this time. Suit and tie, Barclay's tie even, but ugly nonetheless, and not very educated by the sound of it. What did Modupe see in him? "Dele, what did you hear exactly?" Baba was saying. "I heard the shots, so pa. "What shots? Are you sure? What were you drinking?" Baba shook his hands in exasperation. "No, sir. Na shots, real ones, oh. I know they lie, oh. Yes, sir. Na shots. They won't kill 'em." "So what do we do?" "What about the BBC? What are they saying?" Tayo asked, surprised that his father was looking to him for advice. "Nothing," Baba replied, twiddling the radio's knobs back and forth. Go inside, go on," Baba shouted, suddenly irritated by the children who had grown bored and were playing clapping games. The women ushered the children back into the house, leaving the men in the courtyard. Modupe left too, and Tayo watched her go. He didn't care for her husband, but at least she looked happy. He knew he should be happy for her, but still couldn't stop feeling a twinge of sadness and jealousy. "It's not a good sign that they're playing military music," Father muttered, as the men gathered around. "This is something we learnt from the first coup." "What of Uncle Kayode?" Tayo asked. "No word," Baba replied, looking around as though hoping Uncle Kayode might just appear. "Listen," Dele shouted. The music stopped, and the wives and children came scuttling back, in time to hear an announcement by Brigadier Ogundipe. "As a result of some trouble by dissidents in the army, mainly in Ibadan, Abeokuta and Ikeja, the national military government has declared a state of emergency." "A state of emergency? Now wow!" Dele jumped up. "Shh," Baba ordered, straining to hear the voice on the radio. "Military tribunals have been considered and accordingly set up. Curfew has been declared in the affected areas from 6:30 p.m. "Curfew!" someone shouted. "Curfew! Curfew!" others echoed. "They say the situation is under control. Didn't you hear?" Baba shouted. Tayo could tell by the way the veins stood out on Baba's neck that his father was anxious. Nobody knew what was going to happen. Tayo, like everyone else, kept his ear close to the radio, waiting to hear more, but there was only music, and when he looked up, he found that everyone was watching him. "Let's not panic," Tayo said, as calmly as he could. Then, because people seemed to be waiting for him to act, he suggested, with an authority that surprised even himself, that they return to their homes. Chapter 19. The daily papers carried news of Nigeria's coup d'etat, but it was several weeks before Vanessa received Tayo's telegram, letting her know that he and his family were safe. He didn't say when he would be back, but she hoped that it wouldn't be long. She thought often of their last day together, when she'd gone to see him, not knowing until she arrived that he'd received a telegram calling him home. She remembered offering to help him pack, and how he'd responded by pushing the suitcase aside and reaching for her instead. "Come," he'd urged, pulling her towards the bed. He didn't seem to care that it was the middle of the morning, when anyone might pass by. "Shh," he'd insisted, pressing gently against her lips before locking the door. "Better?" he'd smiled, peeling off his shirt as he joined her on the narrow bed that creaked with the added weight. And soon neither of them cared if anyone heard them or the noise of the bed as it thudded against the wooden floors. "You won't leave me, will you?" Vanessa whispered as they lay cuddling together afterwards. "Never," he'd said, wrapping his arm tighter around her waist. "I love you, Vanessa." Vanessa had estimated that Tayo would be back in England by March, but instead, March was when his letters stopped. She wrote, phoned, and sent telegrams, but still no reply. And then, on a day when she was feeling utterly distraught and not knowing what more she could do, she heard that Tayo had been in touch with Baliol. Why hadn't he written to her? And of all times to leave her feeling abandoned, he had chosen the weeks just before her exams. It would be another week before she received Tayo's letter. 20th May, 1967. Dear Vanessa, please forgive me for taking so long to write to you. I have tried to write this letter many times over the past few months, but each time it seems as if the gods have conspired to stop me. First, it was the news of the coup, which by now you must know all about, and then, of course, the start of the civil war. But in between all of this came my father's second heart attack. It has been a very difficult time for my family, but Father is pulling through, and I now feel an immense sense of relief. We were also worried about Uncle Kayode in the midst of all these political events, and I will tell you more about it when I see you, but at least he too is safe and well at this time. I don't know when I'll be returning to Oxford, but soon, I hope. I have been in touch with the college, and they have shown great understanding. I miss you so much, Vanessa, and I do hope that you understand the reason for my silence during this time. I may not have written, but you have been on my mind every single day. I have so many half-finished letters that I started to write to you. I'm rereading one now. People have grown up, and things have changed. The buildings that I once thought of as large now look so small next to the new constructions, offices, banks, hospitals, and schools. And then there's also the heat that I had forgotten. You know how much I hate the cold, and yet this heat is too much. Even the food is spicier than I remember, and you mustn't laugh, but I really think that England has blunted my taste buds. My younger brothers tease me, calling me Oyingbo. That's how we refer to expatriates, for forgetting how to take pepper in my food. I think of you all the time, and when I look at things, I try to imagine what you would see. I'm even using my sense of smell like you. Rain, for example, like the smell of sea meeting earth, so sweet and comforting. And all the wonderful aromas of cooking. This morning, akara is being fried in the back of the house, where the cooking is done. And in the front of our house, there is always the delicious smell of roasted corn. A woman sits out there in the street with her open fire, turning the cobs by hand and selling them to bystanders. Vanessa reread his letter, over and over again, missing him and feeling wretched for what she'd done. Getting drunk out of self-pity had been bad enough, but going off with Charlie was worse. She knew that Tayo would never do anything like that, and if he ever found out... Luckily, nothing much had happened with Charlie, and at least one thing was now clear to her. She wasn't going to keep waiting for Tayo to come back. Now that exams were over, she would go to Nigeria, and nothing, not even the Biafran War, was going to stop her. Telegrams were exchanged, and 2 weeks later, she flew to Nigeria. When she landed in Lagos, the first thing she saw were men in green fatigues, with fat black belts and oversized boots, patrolling the tarmac, with guns slung carelessly across their chests. It brought home to her the fact that here was a war. It was dangerous, and it was reckless of her to come to Nigeria at such a time, especially when Tayo had sent a telegram asking her to postpone her trip. She stood for a moment, trying to take it all in, the heat, the blinding brightness of the sun, people milling around. Then she saw him across the tarmac. Tayo, in a crisp white shirt and sandals, looked cool and devastatingly handsome. And just as quickly as she'd thought about the war, she forgot it. They checked into a hotel. Tayo said they would stay in Lagos for a few days before travelling up to Ibadan to meet his family. It was a small hotel with ceiling fans and private bathrooms. It was perfect and romantic, but first Tayo wanted to show her around. They took a short walk through Lagos, and everywhere they went, people turned to stare. Children followed them, chanting, "Oyingbo Pepe," which made her smile. She told Tayo she felt like the Pied Piper, but Tayo seemed less charmed by the train of followers. More than once he tried shooing the children away, becoming impatient with them. Vanessa had never known Tayo to be impatient, but this was now his country, and she sensed that he was trying to protect her. She felt touched by his concern. She stared at all the beautiful people, some wearing Western clothes, others in more vibrant local attire, hundreds of them, running, dodging, walking, and bicycling as they wove their way along the busy roads, full of polluting lorries and imported cars that honked and beeped incessantly. Market stalls were everywhere, with their rusted tin roofs and women sitting outside, spread out on mats or perched on upside-down buckets, whistling for business with their products piled high in front of them. People laughed and shouted, sometimes all at once. It was all wonderful to Vanessa, but best of all, she was here with Tayo. Late that afternoon, they returned to the hotel. She wasn't hungry, but Tayo insisted that they go to a restaurant, where they ordered rice and plantain. He ordered for her the mildest things on the menu, and yet her eyes still streamed from what the owner claimed to be merely small pepe. Tayo laughed at Vanessa's valiant efforts to eat, reminding her of the time she'd coughed her way through the food at the West African Society in Oxford. He laughed most when they spoke of Oxford, but became more serious when they talked about family and the war. She noticed that occasionally Tayo would just stare into space. She knew he was worried about his father and the state of the country, which was why she agreed to go dancing, even though she was exhausted. She knew that music would relax him. They went to Bobby Benson's, the legendary Bobby B's, where a local band was playing juju. Tayo was his loose and playful self, and this time she joined him, letting go and not feeling self-conscious, even though, as the only white woman, she was watched by everyone. Back in the hotel, there was no electricity, but it didn't matter. They fell into bed, where they were serenaded by the sound of evening crickets and frogs. There, in their dimly lit room, illuminated only by candlelight and enveloped in the piquant smell of insect repellent, they made love. Vanessa woke up early the next morning to find herself alone in bed. Tayo was already up and pacing by the window. She watched him, admiring the curves of his body and the muscles that stood out on his ebony skin, which had grown even darker in the months away. "What is it, Tayo?" He jumped in surprise. "Nothing, my love." He turned to her and lifted the mosquito netting to join her in bed. "I've just got to buy a few medicines for my father," he said, kissing her lightly on the forehead. "Can I come?" "Why don't you stay? I'll be right back." After he left, she took a bath and then wandered around the hotel grounds, stopping to buy some akara from a street seller. She was considering venturing further when she felt stabbing pains in her stomach and hurried back to their room. The next hour was spent cursing herself for having ignored Tayo's advice about eating from the streets. "Did you find the medicines?" she asked sheepishly when he returned. "No," he shook his head. She was about to tell him about her misadventure when she saw the anxious look on his face. "Tayo, what's wrong? Something's not right." He stared past her, looking pained. "I didn't buy the medicine, Vanessa. I just went for a walk to clear my head, but it didn't help." "What is it?" She offered her hand, but he wouldn't take it. "Vanessa, I don't know how else to say this, but—" "What? What is it, Tayo?" "I've had an affair." "You what?" For a second, she felt relief that she wasn't the only one who had done something wrong, except that hers could hardly be called an affair. "And it's worse, Vanessa. It's worse. The woman is pregnant." Vanessa stared at him in shock. "I'm sorry, Vanessa. I just don't know what else to say." "I didn't mean to. It was in a moment of weakness, and it really didn't mean anything." "It didn't mean anything? You lied to me about Christine, and now this? I come all this way for you to tell me this?" "I tried to tell you to delay your trip. Because of the war, you said." "I just wanted it to go away somehow." "Well, it's not going away. What are you going to do?" "I don't know, Vanessa." "You don't know? How can you not know?" "All I know is that I love you, Vanessa." But by then she was gone, slamming the door behind her, only vaguely aware that Tayo was running after her. The heat was making her dizzy, new stabbing pains had seized her stomach, and somewhere, off in the distance, someone was playing Otis Redding's Dock of the Bay.